Hi guys, in this video I'm going to explain request scope from JSP servlets concept. I will show you how to store an object in request object and how to retrieve it and use it. Before going to example, I will explain this concept and then I will show you a simple example. You know that whenever a request is sent to a servlet, request object gets created by the container and this request object is passed to servlet's service method, right? You know all these things, but just a recap. Whenever you send a request, means request to the servlet, the container will create request object. That means an instance of HTTP servlet request class, and it will pass that object to the service method. Okay, so when exactly this object gets created? When a request is sent to a servlet. So after receiving the request, the service method will call doGet or doPost depending on the HTTP method you have used. If you use get, the service method will call doGet. If you use post method, it will call doPost, right? The doGet or doPost will send the response back to the browser. How it will send response to the browser? It will get the printWriter object by calling response.getWriter. As you know, whatever you write into the printWriter object, that response will be reached by the browser. Once the response comes, request object won't be anymore. So the life starts here. Request object is created once the request is reached by the server, right? The container creates here, and when it will be not there, once the response is generated by the servlet, and once that response reaches the browser, that request object will not be there. That means you can think like this, it won't be, it dies. Okay, now if you send another request to the same servlet, then what happens? The same steps repeat. This request object you can forget, that's lost, and when you send a new request, the container will create another request object that is not same as the previous request object. So every time you make a request, new request object gets created by the container. Okay, so in this example you understand that the request object gets created when by the container after receiving the request, and the request object will not be there or dies once the response is received by the browser from the servlet. Okay, there is another scenario. The browser sends a request to the servlet. See, browser sending a request means nothing but typing the web application name / URL pattern of the servlet. There is nothing great here. Okay, so the servlet receives the request, but unlike in the first example, it will forward to the JSP. You know that whenever the servlet forwards the request to the JSP, you know that the container creates the request object, right? And that request object is passed to the service method. If you forward this request using request dispatcher.forward to a JSP, in this case also request object will be created by the container, right? The same request object will be passed to this JSP also. Okay, and this JSP sends response to the browser. So here there is an extra step. Instead of servlet directly sending response, it takes help of the JSP by forwarding the original request object to the JSP, and the JSP sends back the response. In this, there is an additional step. Instead of directly servlet responding to your request, servlet says, hey JSP, take the original request that I got from the container, take that and generate the response and send it back to the browser. Okay, so this is the request response lifecycle. So the request object creates here, and request object will not be there once the browser gets the response back from the request. In this case, it is very simple. Request sends to the servlet and servlet directly send back the response. But in this case, extra step is involved. Here, servlet forwards the request to the JSP to take care of the request. It won't directly process the request. Okay, now what we can do is, once the request object is created, right, you can store something into that request object. How can we store is, we can use request.set attribute. It is like, you can think like hash key, means hash table or hash map, like key value pairs. You give some name and give the object, and that object will be bound with that name, like, okay, like key value pairs. The key will be some name to identify the object, and the value will be some object, some Java object. It can be array list, it can be an employee object, or anything. Sorry. So using set attribute method, you can set something into the request object, and if you want to retrieve that object, you can use get attribute. If there is no object, if you call the get attribute without calling the set attribute, then you will get null, because you are trying to retrieve some object with a name, but with that name you didn't set it previously. When I show the example, it will be very clear to you. So in this example also, so in the request object, you can store something using set attribute. You can get that value using get attribute. Okay, so don't say in interviews request object dies. This is just for explaining the concept. That means by here the response reached the browser, right? At this time, by this time, request object is gone. In this case, response is not directly received by a processor by the or sent by the servlet. Instead, servlet took the help of JSP. Remember, the original request object will be forwarded to the JSP. So the JSP sends back the response. So in this case, response object is gone after this step, means after JSP sends the response back to the browser or client. Okay, let us start with an example. I have created a simple servlet. It is called servlet 2. There is nothing great coding here. You know that internally, based on the HTTP method, doGet or doPost will be called. Both these doGet and doPost are calling process request. So the control reaches here. In this, what I did was, I'm storing the Java trainer name. Means Venkat is the person who teaches Java. So I set his name with the as a Java trainer name. Okay, the Venkat is Java trainer. Okay, so to identify Venkat, you have to, if in the future after you make this call, after you write this code, if you want if you want to find out who is Java trainer, you can simply call, in the previous picture I have explained, right? you have to use request.get attribute. So I am displaying first. I have set the value, and while sending the response I have used the request.get attribute. What you have to find who is the Java trainer, what you have to do to get this value, you have to give this value on the left hand side. So Java trainer name, and when you say request.get attribute of Java trainer name, it will give Venkat. So I'm going to find out Java trainer name using get attribute. So the response will be like this. Let me run this. Can you see? I am invoking a second servlet. I am going to find out Java trainer name using get attribute. The get attribute return the trainer name as Venkat. Okay. Now we will see we have covered this one. Okay. I have first what I did. I have sent a request to the second servlet. So the browser sends a request to the second servlet. The request object got created, right? And I have kept the value called Venkat in this request object, right? In the process request, again I got that value using get attribute, and I just displayed that or prepared the response using that value, right? I got that value, and using out.println, what is the out? Whatever you write something using println, it will reach the browser, right? I have appended the trainer name. So I have covered this step. So what we did is we set some value and we could retrieve that value. How long we can retrieve that value? If we set some value in the request object, you can retrieve that before this request object is gone. That means before the response is reached by the browser, you can access that value from the request object, because once the response is reached by the browser, there is no, that request object won't be there. So if you call it, there is nothing like that object after the response is reached, right? If you invoke this servlet again, a new HTTP request object will be created. It won't be same, and it won't contain the value you have set previously. Means the Java trainer name won't be available. And we will see this example. Browser sends a response to the servlet, request to the servlet. The servlet forwards the request to the JSP. As you know, while forwarding, you use .forward, request dispatcher .forward, and you will pass request comma response. So the container creates two objects, request and response. These two objects will be passed to the JSP, and this JSP, before forwarding the request to the JSP, after the request object is created, in the servlet I will set .NET trainer in the request scope using set attribute method, and this original request object will be forwarded to the JSP, right? In the JSP, what I will do is I will retrieve the value I have set in the servlet, and I will display that value. Let us see this. I have created another servlet called servlet1. Okay, as I explained in the second scenario, now the request reaches the servlet. You know that the container creates the request and response object, and it will pass to the service method, and the service method will call the doGet or doPost method, right? So these are the request and response objects. What I will do in the servlet, I will set the name of the .NET trainer. See, the .NET trainer is no one so far, means there is no .NET trainer. So I have set that value for an example. So if you want to know .NET trainer, you have to say request.get attribute and give this value. Okay, now I have kept the .NET trainer in the request object that gets created when the request is received by the servlet, right? And then I forward the request to the JSP. So in the JSP, if you want the trainer, you can call request.getAttribute by providing the string which you have given. So once after I set this value, I am forwarding the request. If you see, the original request which is received by this servlet, I am transferring those two objects also to the JSP. So this JSP page can access that request and response objects, right? Now the control reaches to 2.jsp. In 2.jsp, what I have done, I am retrieving the value of .NET trainer. Okay, how can I retrieve? You can, in the JSP, if you want to access the request object, you have to say request, right? This is an implicit object. You cannot change the name of this. This is a implicit object. Whenever you want to access the request, HTTP servlet request object, you can simply say request. If you want to find the attribute, simply say give that name and you can get the value. Okay, now we will do here is, now I will access first servlet. Okay, once the request is reached by the servlet, this servlet, first servlet, sets the what? .NET trainer name as no one so far, and then the request will be forwarded to 2.jsp, right? Can you see? In the my previous video I have explained, whenever we dispatch using forward method, the URL won't be changed, but now the response came from the with JSP 2.jsp. Internally we have forwarded the request. So if you see this, I retrieved .NET trainer. What is the value? None, so no one so far, right? It's correct. Now I have created a hyperlink to the index.jsp, and if I want to find the .NET trainer name, I have written this code. Let us check if I can retrieve .NET trainer name from index.jsp. Okay, let us click this. Can you see .NET trainer name is null? Can you understand why? If you understand this concept properly, you know already this answer, because once the response is received by the browser, this request object will be gone, right? So this JSP sent a HTML containing the hyperlink. That hyperlink, when you click, it makes a new request to the index.jsp. When I click on this hyperlink, the browser will create a new request to the index.jsp, right? As you know from this figure, this can be a servlet or JSP. Whenever a request is sent to the servlet or JSP, container will create the new request object. So once the response is reached by the browser, if you click on the hyperlink to the JSP, a new request will be generated. So in that request object, we didn't set the .NET trainer name so far. That is the reason we are not able to retrieve the .NET trainer name from the index.jsp, because this is the request response cycle. The request is sent to the servlet 1, it forwarded the request to the JSP, so still the request object is there. This JSP page generated a HTML content with the hyperlink. So this response is sent back to the browser, right? So by this time the response object is gone, but the browser rendered a HTML page with an hyperlink, right? So response came, but the original request is gone. So when you click the hyperlink to the index.jsp, what happens? Now another request is sent to which page? To index.jsp. Now what will happen? A new request object gets created. So this request object and this request object are not same. So in this servlet I have set the .NET trainer in this object, right? But if you try to retrieve .NET trainer in the index.jsp, you cannot get it because this is entirely new request, right? That is the reason we got null in the index.jsp. Okay, so you can understand now that you can get the object that you have set using set attribute only up to the time the browser receives the response. Once the browser receives the response may be directly come from servlet, or the response may come from the JSP to which we forwarded the request. So once the response comes in, it may be like this, or it may be forwarded and the response may come back like this, and by this time response object, so request object will be gone, right? So if you make a new request, it will create a new request and you can't access because that original request object is out of scope. It's no more, you can't get it. Hope you understand the request scope completely. You can set anything into the request object, any Java object. In this example I have set a string, but in the real time you can, before forwarding the request to the JSP, hit the DAO layer, get all the employees, okay, populate them into employee objects, add them into the list, put that list into the request object by request.setAttribute give employee list comma that array list, and once the request is reached by the JSP can access that employee list by saying request.getAttribute of emp list, and you have to typecast into the array list and iterate it, generate the HTML content. Hope you understand. Thank you.